Alors, mesdames et messieurs, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back, figuratively speaking. Hope you enjoyed the lunch. And we're going to dive right back into our program with a talk about Canada's perhaps emerging Indo-Pacific strategy. And I'm so pleased to be standing here with you. You don't know how pleased I am to be introducing Paul Thoppil, Assistant Deputy Minister, Asia-Pacific at Global Affairs Canada. You can see the full details of Paul's biography in the program. J'aimerais juste noter quelques faits sur Paul. Having served as a senior diplomat for Canada in Japan and in various senior positions across the federal government in Ottawa, Paul became Assistant Deputy Minister, Asia-Pacific in July 2019, which I'm sure seems like a decade ago now. But I want to introduce Paul the person because I served as Consul General of Canada in Hong Kong for almost 5 years, from August 2016 until last year. And in this capacity, I got to know and work closely with Paul through what was a very eventful period, I think, in both our lives. And I've continued to have that privilege since I became CEO of the Asia-Pacific Foundation a year ago. And let's face it, the ADM Asia-Pacific is a brutal job. The territory stretches from Pakistan in the west to the Pacific Islands in the east, north, south, everything in between, 60% of the world's population, more than 40 Canadian diplomatic missions and offices. And over the years, the last 3 years that I've seen Paul become a person with really deep and broad expertise and insight into Asia. For our stakeholders in Vancouver, he has come, he did a roundtable last year and was incredibly generous with his time in briefing those on the West Coast who were interested in what Canada was doing in the Indo-Pacific region, and also showed just incredible mastery of all of those complicated files and in what's really been an extraordinary period. Paul he's a good listener, and he's a genuinely curious person, and I'm sure he's curious to know what questions you will have for him. As there has been a mild degree of controversy attached to this conference in the last 24 hours, yet here he is, and we're grateful to him for following through on his commitment to be with us today. So please join me in welcoming Canada's Assistant Deputy Minister for the Asia-Pacific, Paul Thoppil.
Jeff, thank you so much for that really kind introduction. When I have my performance assessment done with my boss, I'm going to bring you in to talk about my job. That was really awesome. We are gathered on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin peoples, and I really want to thank them for sharing their lands with us today. So it is a pleasure for me to be among people who share my passion for East Asia. Or as I said to Paul Evans in the room before, I consider you affectionately my peeps. And I look forward to a productive, stimulating forum. You know, last year, about 800 delegates participated in the inaugural edition of the East Asia Pacific Forum, which was held entirely online. Now, this year's event, a mix of virtual and in-person, I think is turning out to be even better. Delegates include academics and researchers, policymakers, foreign military officials, current and former diplomats, and business leaders. I think this diversity of background and expertise, along with the forum's focus on the free exchange of ideas, I think leads to intelligent discussion and the kind of cross-pollination that really improves policymaking. So I'm grateful to you. I congratulate conference organizers for assembling such an astute program and for securing so many distinguished speakers and panelists. So let's hats off to our co-hosts, please. The Institute of Peace and Diplomacy and the Asia-Pacific Foundation of Canada. Bravo. So as you may know, the Government of Canada expects to announce the long-awaited Indo-Pacific strategy this fall. And while I can't share what's in the strategy's current draft, I can describe the thinking behind it. And I think the thinking behind it is just as important, in my humble opinion, as the contents thereof. And afterwards, I'll do my best to answer any questions you may have, noting that the tough ones I will hand over to Jeff to address himself. So, an Indo-Pacific strategy for Canada. Why? Many factors drive the Government of Canada to create and implement an Indo-Pacific strategy. Canada is a prosperous and progressive trading nation that has been blessed with a wealth of advantages, such as bountiful natural resources and a favorable geographic location adjacent to the world's largest economy. Canada makes the most of these advantages thanks to a long-standing commitment to peace, order, and good government. Now, while this remains true, rapid evolutions in international dynamics are forcing us to adapt and adjust to new realities. At the macro level, the world is changing at a faster pace than ever before. Economic landscapes are shifting, environmental pressures are reaching alarming levels, and renewed great power competition is a source of increased instability. So in this broad context, the Indo-Pacific's strategic significance is growing. And in virtually every sphere, economic, technological, military, social, and environmental, the Indo-Pacific plays an ever larger role in global affairs. And over the last 4 decades, the economic growth of this region has been nothing short of remarkable. But while this rise has helped to increase living standards for hundreds of millions of people, many challenges remain unresolved. The region is not exempt from authoritarian challenges launched against democratic norms and principles. Diplomatic, economic, and military coercion are on the rise. Supply chains are being weaponized, and human rights and media freedoms cannot be taken for granted. This last claim is made evident by the recent report by the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights on the human rights situation in Xinjiang. Its findings reflect the credible accounts of grave human rights violations taking place in Xinjiang. It also found the arbitrary and discriminatory detention of Uyghurs and other Muslim ethnic minorities, which may constitute international crimes, in particular crimes against humanity. Canada has engaged directly with the government of China at the highest political levels regarding the human rights situation in Xinjiang. We have condemned human rights violations by China alongside our Five Eyes allies, the G7, and the United Nations Human Rights Council. Just yesterday, Canada's ambassador to the United Nations delivered a statement on the plight of the Uyghur people in Xinjiang on behalf of 50 countries. Canada urged China to respond to the conclusions of the Bachelet report and expressed concern that China has so far refused to discuss its findings. And that is because Canada will always stand up for human rights. In our engagement in the Indo-Pacific and across the world, we will always defend and advance our national interest. And we will never forgo our principles. Human rights violations cannot be defended under the pretext of national sovereignty. States, big or small, must abide by the same rules. This brings me to my next point. The rules-based international order is under pressure from non-status quo actors acting in a revisionist fashion to serve their own narrow interests in the region. The economic downturn triggered by the pandemic exacerbates this problem as the Indo-Pacific region faces its deepest slowdown in more than 50 years. Now, allow me to add another important point of context here that directly touches on Canada's national interest. Looking at the longer term, we are acutely aware that several sea trading nations from the Indo-Pacific are now looking at the Arctic with increasing interest, with seaborne trade expected to increase significantly over the next 10 to 15 years, and sea ice retreating in the Bering Strait, the Beaufort Sea, and the Chukchi Sea. Arctic waters are increasingly becoming attractive for commercial shipping, and with this will inevitably become significant challenges for Canada that we need to be ready to address. Finally, I should mention that our people-to-people ties with the Indo-Pacific have deepened significantly over time. For decades, more immigrants to Canada have come from the Indo-Pacific than any other region. Today, 18% of Canadians have family ties to the region, and the Indo-Pacific is our largest source of foreign students. So, in light of those broad strokes, I think we can all agree that it's high time that Canada clearly set out its goals for the region and how it plans to achieve them. Many of Canada's partners have responded to these trends and developments over the last decade by designing and implementing new strategies for the Indo-Pacific and by forging new alliances and partnerships. A few years ago, Australia, Japan, the United States, France, and India were the first countries to elaborate targeted national approaches dedicated to this region. And more recently, they have been followed by Germany, the Netherlands, the UK, and the European Union. We also see the emergence of new plurilateral groupings. Although several such groups exist, one prime example is AUKUS, this new security alliance between the US, Australia, and the United Kingdom. These initiatives have the potential to inspire cooperation on everything from regional security to energy, climate change, and healthcare, all topics of great interest to Canada. So our view is that Canada can no longer just sit by and rely on our conception of what regional order should look like as if every country followed a blueprint conceived in the 1990s. The reality is, if we don't adjust our diplomacy to new realities and new forms of cooperation, we risk falling behind some of our peers and being left out of discussions that will shape the region for the next several decades. In the face of these trends, we too need to adapt to new circumstances. So, Canada's Indo-Pacific strategy, what to expect? Our Indo-Pacific strategy should allow us to diversify our engagement and deepen our diplomatic, security, economic, and sustainable development partnerships in the region. Let me start by saying a few words on peace and security. We recognize that regional prosperity is first and foremost underwritten by regional stability. And as there are numerous flashpoints, combustible issues and disputes in the Indo-Pacific region, fostering peace, resilience, and security should always be a priority in Canada's approach. As you know, nearly 2/3 of global maritime trade flows through the hotly contested South China Sea. This simple stat suffices to demonstrate that closely working with our partners and allies to advance security and respect for international law, including the law of the sea, across the region is not a choice, but a pressing necessity. Canada is increasingly active in that realm, though. In recent years, Canada has expanded its security and defense presence in the Indo-Pacific through an enhanced naval presence and growing contributions to multilateral initiatives. One such initiative aims to counter North Korea's efforts to evade maritime sanctions. Under Operation Neon, Canada deploys ships, aircraft, and personnel to detect and deter illegal ship-to-ship transfers and to gather intelligence on the vessels and entities involved. More generally, Canada has some highly sought-after skills and technologies that can be applied to issues related to marine and oceans governance that could be applied in the Indo-Pacific region. And we are also increasingly having to address non-traditional security concerns in the region. Issues like cybersecurity and state-sponsored disinformation, illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, and the potential impact of climate change on regional populations now occupy much more bandwidth in security and disaster response planning circles than they just did 5 or 10 years ago. Let me talk about commercial engagement. Throughout Canada's history, our trade and foreign policies have largely prioritized relationships with the United States and Europe. Now, while this approach has undoubtedly served us well, times are changing. Today, and for decades to come, events in the Indo-Pacific will significantly influence many of Canada's and the world's most fundamental challenges, such as preserving peace, fostering prosperity, and combating climate change. Of course, Canada has always been a Pacific-facing nation, 25,000 kilometers of coastline to boot. And our ties with the Indo-Pacific has grown stronger in recent years. The annual value of our two-way trade with countries in the region now exceeds $200 billion, for instance. During the last decade, the value of foreign direct investment in both directions nearly doubled to reach $219 billion. As Jeff noted, Canada maintains no fewer than 42 diplomatic missions across the Indo-Pacific and is an active partner in leading regional organizations, including APEC and the ASEAN Regional Forum. You know, in spite of the COVID slowdown, the Indo-Pacific remains the world's fastest growing regional economy and a critical hub for trade, investment, and production. Expanding Canada's commercial footprint in this part of the world will go a long way towards securing prosperity for future generations. To achieve this goal, we must diversify our business networks, we must find new partners, and enter and succeed in new markets. A simple but powerful and profound idea will be, I expect, at the core of our Indo-Pacific strategy. That the cooperation engendered by effective, mutually beneficial international trade in goods and services can inspire progress on a wide range of economic, social, and environmental issues. The strategy, I hope, will position Canada as a reliable trading partner, willing to collaborate on creating a peaceful, stable, equitable, and green world. One statistic helps drive this point home. By one estimate, Indo-Pacific countries will require $33 trillion worth of new infrastructure by the end of the current decade. Now imagine the many projects needed to create this infrastructure. Now consider the opportunities, though, that those projects open up. Opportunities to not only strengthen supply chains, but also to develop and integrate green technologies and combat and mitigate the effects of climate change. Because we know, for those who know the region, the Indo-Pacific is particularly vulnerable to climate change. According to the United Nations, the region could have as many as 89 million climate refugees by 2050. These infrastructure projects could also strengthen regional security and support and promote social equity, community well-being, other worthwhile goals. The Indo-Pacific strategy should aim to make the most of the opportunities created by international cooperation. Now, as a member of the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, Canada is already well positioned in the region. We are a signatory to several trade agreements in the Indo-Pacific. Canadian companies have much to offer foreign buyers in many crucial industries, such as clean tech, artificial intelligence, and quantum computing, just to name a few. To help Canadian entrepreneurs succeed in the region, more than 350 Canadian trade commissioners work every day to create new partnerships and enhance existing ones. So as you can see, Canada is already well engaged in this part of the world, but we can and we will do more. New initiatives are already underway, such as exploratory talks with Taiwan on FIPA, the Foreign Investment Protection Agreement, negotiations with ASEAN and Indonesia on free trade agreements, first steps towards establishing an ambitious Canadian trade gateway in Southeast Asia, and push for early progress trade deal with India. As you heard a few days ago, we will also be seeking membership in the new Indo-Pacific Economic Framework to work with our closest regional partners on supply chains, a cleaner economy, high standards for trade, and on transparency. An Indo-Pacific strategy will allow us to go even further. Let me now talk about international assistance. No doubt, the Indo-Pacific is home to tremendous opportunities for Canadian businesses that I've just elaborated on. But this shouldn't overshadow the fact that development-related issues remain prevalent all over the region. For example, the UN recently rang the alarm bell to the effect that COVID-19 pandemic consequences may prevent the region from achieving all 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Humanitarian aid and development assistance is thus another aspect that needs to be front and center in our strategy. Currently, Canada contributes to 9 bilateral and 2 regional international assistance programs in the region, as well as to the Asian Development Bank and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Although the total amount of Canada's bilateral assistance in the region has declined in recent years, Global Affairs Canada has contributed more than $800 million in 2019-20, which constitutes around 18% of our total official development assistance worldwide. We have a unique opportunity, though, to build upon those relationships to further strengthen our reputation as a credible and valued development partner. Our feminist international assistance policy represents a unique value added that we can bring to the table to address issues such as deeply entrenched poverty, climate change, inclusive growth, food security, and disaster management. But let's be clear about the need for cooperation. An Indo-Pacific strategy will have to emphasize stability, prosperity, and inclusive development. And therefore, to be successful, it will have to fully take into consideration how we can deepen or expand our regional partnerships. As such, it requires us to work alongside willing partners to achieve our objectives. By definition, the rules-based international order requires broad collaboration. No single country, regardless of size, can ensure the order's success. Instead, it will require that many partners work in common cause. But as a founding member of APEC, a dialogue partner of ASEAN, and one of 5 founding dialogue partners of the Pacific Island Forum, I believe Canada is well positioned to influence key decisions. So, in conclusion, in the decades to come, the Indo-Pacific will significantly influence the course of the world events and also Canada's future trajectory. The region's many far-reaching and complex challenges are offset by a wealth of current and emerging opportunities. By expanding our presence and by deepening and nurturing key relationships, we can contribute to shape the region. More than ever, we will need a structured, whole of government, and if I may say, whole of country approach to this region. To achieve our goals and protect our interests, we must leverage our national advantages and collaborate with like-minded partners to build upon the full breadth of existing presence and programs we have. This is exactly what I hope Canada's forthcoming Indo-Pacific strategy intends to do, and I look forward to sharing hopefully more details later this fall when the time is right. That's a teaser. In the meantime, I can say that implementing this strategy successfully will require the input and support of people like the men and women participating in this forum. A generation ago, Canadian researchers developed a reputation for engaged and progressive thinking on the region, which helped launch a number of important regional discussions. Today, Canadian knowledge and expertise can and should influence again how this region will progress in the future. I'm counting on your help. I'm counting on your step up. And I encourage you to share your ideas freely this afternoon and in the next day. And I look forward, hopefully, to what I expect is a continued spirited discussion on this most amazing region of the world. Thank you very much.
So thank you, Paul. I think you can consider us teased now. I'm going to open up. I know I anticipate there's a lot of interest from the floor in asking questions of our guest. So while you're thinking those up, and as was the case this morning, we'll ask people to make their way to the microphones over here and over here to ask your questions. Let me prime the pump a bit with a sort of a two-part question, Paul. So as has been well remarked upon, this strategy has been a long time in the making. During the time that the strategy has been worked on, particularly in the last half year or so, we've seen one fundamental contextual change globally, but with particular impacts in Asia, which is a crisis in food security and a crisis in energy security. And I'd be curious to know, recognizing the constraints you may be under, but if this contextual change, so there are partners in Asia, countries in Asia who are looking to Canada to really ramp up the availability of energy resources for export to Asia to ease a crisis for many places in Asia. And similarly with food, there are many partners in Asia who are looking to Canada to be to really step up as a source of food and agri-food commodities. This, for us to step up dramatically, would require significant investments in domestic infrastructure, which is busting at the seams right now to deliver the things that we are already delivering, and may also require policy changes when it comes to approaches to policy towards different energy sources and carbon emission targets and greenhouse gas emission targets and so on. So has this change in the last half year or so really caused a rethink here in Ottawa about domestic policy on those two key areas, and what can you say about that?
Thank you, Jeff. A really good question. Well, I mean, I think from a top-line perspective, I think the food security and energy issues that have come to the fore, particularly in the aftermath of Russia's invasion on Ukraine, has, I think from the Indo-Pacific strategies development, has accelerated the need for it. Because as you rightly noted, food security and energy security, for which many countries around the world, and including in this region, have taken for granted, have now understood its fragility. And what we are seeing is an increased demand for Canada in this world, whether on food security. It's where already Indonesia, as we all know, is sort of the third largest wheat buyer for Canada, from Canada. We know that for certain import-dependent countries, and I would say Japan included, that we have risen to the fore there. Obviously, energy security, they know we are one of the world's largest natural gas producers, one of the world's largest oil producers. The development of LNG Canada has now attracted so much increased worldwide scrutiny. So that has been acknowledged in various high-level visits from abroad to our country. It's been acknowledged in our leader and various ministers' travels abroad. And so while the crisis is unfortunate in terms of the impacts on peoples globally, and in particular in the region, it therefore provides an underlying rationale for more of Canada, both globally, but particularly of this region for which I've noted. obviously, you can't move forward in terms of heightened engagement if it's only the Foreign Affairs Ministry that's engaging. It needs a whole of government approach, and that's why the strategy has been taking in one part so long. The federal government, the various levels of government are large and undertaking with various different mandates. We all need to row the same way. And that means that if we are going to do trade, we need to ensure that we deliver on buyers' terms and conditions on supply. It does have, obviously, downstream impacts on our national transportation corridor. I think that is being well acknowledged going forward. So it's a very complex issue, both in terms of the impacts in the region and its peoples, the opportunities that is emerging for Canada, and the challenges in Canada's domestic infrastructure to supply.
Well, thanks for that. And I know there are stakeholders, particularly in Western Canada, who are very anxious to see if, in the context of an Indo-Pacific strategy, there will be some major domestic initiatives on the kind of hard, complicated work of putting in place new and expanded infrastructure for trade and for resource exploitation. So we're going to go to questions now, and I'll just ask people, because not everyone was here this morning, if you're asking a question, to introduce yourself and then give us your question.
Hi there. Excuse me, Zach Pakin. I'm a non-resident research fellow here with the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy, and also a researcher at the Center for European Policy Studies in Brussels. Thanks so much, Paul, for being with us today. We really appreciate it. I have a couple of questions for you. One is, I'm wondering if you can situate Canada's Indo-Pacific strategy within broader Canadian foreign policy priorities, and to the extent that we can talk of one, Canada's grand strategy, so to speak. Canada is a country, of limited resources, and I'm wondering if there has been any reflection in the context of putting together an Indo-Pacific strategy of whether additional commitments to the Indo-Pacific theater may come at the expense of Canadian contributions to other theaters, perhaps in Europe or elsewhere. In other words, should we interpret the publication of an Indo-Pacific strategy as a pivot by Canada to the Indo-Pacific region, or rather, should we not interpret it that way? And my second question for you concerns the term which you mentioned a few times in your own remarks, which is that of a rules-based international order, which, of course, is the term that was at the center of then Foreign Minister Chrystia Freeland's remarks to Parliament several years ago. But in a more recent and well-publicized address of hers in Washington, D.C. at the Brookings Institution, the central theme appeared to be less focused on the rules-based international order and more on the confrontation or rivalry between democracy and autocracy. And I'm wondering if there has been any reflection on the extent to which these two guiding themes may be to an extent mutually exclusive, because rules-based order implies an inclusive order in which the same rules apply to everyone, whereas democracy versus authoritarianism is clearly dividing a region or the world into different spheres or different blocks, or call it what you will. And therefore, it could be seen as if pursuing an approach to foreign policy rooted in democracy versus authoritarianism could therefore erode some of the foundations of inclusivity that are necessary to uphold a rules-based international order which requires engagement with states that we may find distasteful. So just a couple of questions there on some of the logic underpinning the strategy and the extent to which it's been reflected upon. Thank you.
Those are a number of comprehensive questions. Let me start with your first one, which is the Indo-Pacific strategy. I think for those who are Canadian foreign policy watchers, scholars, you will note that we don't have a long track record in foreign policy making in terms of having a regional-based strategy be our Canadian foreign policy. We've done that, I think, once in the recent past, and that was under Prime Minister Harper's era, whereby he embraced an America strategy. And I think the development of an Indo-Pacific strategy, so essentially shining a spotlight on one part of the world, is just internally to the foreign ministry a hard lift, culturally. Imagine we are a G7 country, a G20 country, Commonwealth, La Francophonie, members of various organizations around the world, a deep commitment in international aid, in particular towards Africa. How do you then prioritize one region at the expense of the other? It's very hard. But I do hope that in my remarks, I cited a few stats which have tried to rise to the fore, the various either thematics you could apply to foreign policy or a geographic lens to a policy to kind of say that for Canada, it makes a lot of sense to develop an Indo-Pacific strategy. I think the fiscal realities are a challenge. It's a challenge on various levels. It's a challenge based on domestic needs. People are concerned about housing affordability. They're worried about inflation. They're worried about getting their kids to school, right? They're worried about climate change impacts in our home country. Just look at Fiona. And they want Canada, and they want their government to be prepared for that. And we have, and you've seen the mandate letter commitments from the Prime Minister issued to cabinet ministers. There's significant initiatives and huge bills that are associated with that. On top of that mammoth agenda of the government, there lies an international landscape that is also putting challenges on the fiscal envelope. Ukraine and Canada's contribution to support Ukraine is multi-level. It's multi-level in terms of just financial liquidity support to the government there and to the country to keep it going. It's the military supply effort to keep it going. It's the diplomatic lift. It's the military being stationed in Eastern Europe. Those are huge costs, but we're rising to the challenge. Then, of course, the question from Jeff was right. There is food security and energy security demands globally. Climate change impacts, look at our region, the catastrophic climate change flooding in Pakistan, and now Canada is contributing there. So the international financial element of the fiscal envelope has never been challenged before. So all of that has to come to being because in the end, there's only one taxpayer, and that has to be paid either now or through our successive generations. So that all has to come to the mix, right? So it's not easy. But that being said, there is a speech from the throne commitment to develop an Indo-Pacific strategy, and 4 ministers of the Crown have mandate letter commitments to develop one. And I think the government has heard from the region that they don't want this strategy to come across as transactional. They want this to be a strategy for which they want us to come forward with some degree of humility, and they want us to come forward with understanding their needs and responsive to it. And that, unfortunately, comes with a bit of a price tag. I'm so pleased I'm not the Minister of Finance in terms of how she has to wrestle all those international and domestic challenges. But those issues are real. On your second question, I think what we've seen in terms of the changing international landscape is a reflection of whether countries have taken their values and interests that we have considered sort of base and now have seen it been fragile. And I talk about issues such as democracy, freedom of expression, things that perhaps we just took for granted because we always knew it was always there. But I think over the last decade or so, we've seen some degree of fragility associated with it, and now understand that we need to invest in it to keep it strong. But it's not necessarily our values or norms that we share in our country are shared by others. Now, there are extremes, but there's also a deep middle ground. I call it, personally, the middle ground countries. Those are countries that are sort of in between democracies and autocracies. And in fact, I would argue those are the majority of the countries. They are being wooed by both sides of the extreme. And we need to be mindful of that because they, in fact, working with them, develop the mass in order to move to shape or to sustain the international rules-based order, and in fact, indirectly, through that mass, shore up those values and norms that we as Canadians hold dear, such as democracy and freedom of expression going forward. So I wouldn't necessarily embrace the binary aspect of it, because those who are truly the international experts in this world, here in this room, will acknowledge that there is no binary to international relations or the global milieu. It's shades of gray defined by, first, a country's national self-interest and ensuring that its values and interests are a bedrock for its engagement globally.
Thanks very much.
So I have one question here, and then we're going to go over there. Please.
Thanks very much. My name is John Price from the University of Victoria. The question I have is very specific as opposed to the grand strategy questions. The Canadian Armed Forces are more active in the Pacific region. You mentioned Operation Neon. And one of the things that struck me in terms of the activities is that the Canadian Armed Forces are increasingly utilizing United States bases in Okinawa. Those bases have been the target of the peace movement in Okinawa for many, many years. And they are also the target of Indigenous Okinawans who have demanded that those bases not be in Okinawa. And so my question to you is in relationship to truth and reconciliation. Global Affairs Canada has recently adopted truth and reconciliation as one of its guidelines, frameworks for policymaking. I want to know, does truth and reconciliation or recognition of Indigenous rights extend to the Pacific? And if so, why are we getting ensconced in the US bases in Okinawa when in fact recently Dennis Tamaki, the governor, was re-elected in Okinawa specifically on an anti-base platform and with the expressed desire for US bases to be out of Okinawa?
I'm really grateful that you raised the issue of the Indigenous peoples. I think from Canada's perspective, I would say that one of the opportunities that the Indo-Pacific strategy could advance is, in fact, the reality that there is, by one count, 1/3 of global Indigenous peoples lies in the Indo-Pacific region. And there is tremendous opportunities for our Indigenous peoples to engage for both trade, education, and people-to-people links that there was from time immemorial before the settlers came to Canada. And now the strategy, I hope, just provides a pathway to restore what was once there. So I think that there is huge opportunities for Indigenous links, that for which Canada is already leading on by signing on to APECTA, which is the Indigenous Peoples Economic Trade Agreement between Canada, Taiwan, New Zealand, and Chile, to name, and Australia, to name a few countries. On the specific issue of the U.S. bases in Okinawa, I think that we do look forward to an engagement by Japan in terms of its engagement with its Indigenous peoples and ensuring that that is done in a respectful way as Canada is trying to go through its journey of truth and reconciliation. We have gone through a dark chapter in our history in terms of our treatment of Indigenous peoples. We are going through a path, a journey of reconciliation. It's not going to be an effort overnight. It's going to be done through decades, perhaps generations going forward. And that's a journey that other countries with their Indigenous peoples will need to essentially follow as well. Thanks.
Just a question of context. I think someone mentioned earlier the vision of a coherent strategy for Indo-Pacific or for Asia would be a very good thing for Canada. And then you concluded your last answer about long-term commitment. It takes follow-through. My question is just when I first joined Foreign Affairs, my name's Craig Wilson. I'm a retired Foreign Service officer. 47 years ago. I did a little study at the request of my boss, and it looked at our market share in each country across Asia. And it was interesting, and I just pass it on for the vision you are going to construct. We were from 4th to 10th in most Asian markets in those days. So we've been retreating for 70 years. That's not the question. The question is, do you have a vision to recapture some of that? When I'm really feeling like being confrontational, I point out that we had 50% of Asian America's trade in 1897 when those great Empress Pacifics were coming across, and we were running the railway line to the UK. So it's an artificial construct, but do we have are you thinking of, do you have a sense that you can give us of the vision you're going to put in place, for which will hopefully be long-term political commitment and all the various connectors, all of the diaspora from these countries that are here in Canada now that we can build on, all of the social, community, education, et cetera links? Thank you.
I think we're very mindful of the statistics that you articulated well, Craig. And so I'm really grateful to you for the reminder, which underscores that we have a bit of a lift we have to do, but which correlates with, quite frankly, the opportunity. So when I think about Southeast Asia marketplace and the 600 million people there, when I think about India, one of the largest growth rate among large economies in the world, I'm very excited about the opportunities for business. And I think that there is, and what I see is an acknowledgement of that by the Government of Canada in terms of reaching out to India and Indonesia and ASEAN in terms of sending a signal to Canadian business of where you should go globally in terms of capturing those growth rates for you. Now, Canadian government can set the table. We can create the framework. We can even station what is some amazing of my colleagues, some of them who are in this room, amazing trade commissioners in order to help facilitate. But Canadian business has to understand that opportunity, develop business development plans, and they got to marshal those funds in order to take advantage of those opportunities that the government is creating and signaling in terms of where to go. And so I am hopeful that the Indo-Pacific strategy will provide some set of initiatives that will further capitalize on the frameworks that the government is trying to create in the region.
Okay, we're going to do one more question over here.
Hello, my name is Jennifer Irish. Until recently, I was in government. I'm now a consultant, and I have one relationship with the University of Ottawa. Trying to understand just this strategy, I want to kind of focus on what are the key elements for cooperation that Canada will lead on. And I guess from a threats and opportunities perspective, the drivers are both geopolitical, and then you've raised a series of transnational challenges. But your strategy is based on the pillars of many geographic strategies. It's peace and diplomacy, commercial aid. And then you've talked about some of the interests as being both value and interest-based. So values being democracy, the democratic or liberal world order, and the interests largely being economic. And then in terms of the means of implementation, within the region, it strikes me that the currency is more about hard power, but Canada's value added may be more about soft power. And if we keep just advocating democracy and the world order in an environment where people don't really want to choose, and I think that's particularly the case in some parts of Asia, but it strikes me that there's areas that Canada could work upon that would help provide the enablers to either democracy or the rules-based order without actually just being in the realm of advocacy. Areas like like equity, equity between genders, social equity, areas like governance. I would very much like you to talk about governance. Security cooperation, everything from community policing to how you combat organized crime and terrorism, as well as some of the security issues that Jeff raised in terms of food security, water security. And I guess that was a long preamble, for which I apologize. But I was just trying to get at, in terms of how you actually want to execute Canada's interests. What are the primary instruments that you see in a global political environment in Asia Pacific, which is very fluid right now, and where countries don't necessarily see themselves as either the agent of one order or another order?
Thanks, Jennifer. It's a really good question. I think we need to start off with the fact that the region is not homogeneous, to say the obvious, and that the needs and what they're looking for from Canada differentiate themselves across the region, from Pakistan and India on one side to the Pacific Islands, to what our Aussie and New Zealand friends are looking for, to Japan and above. So it's not a one-size-fits-all. And also there are things that we bring to the table that some of our friends and allies don't. So let me start with that second one first, in terms of what we bring to the table relative to some of what our friends and allies don't. So one, when it comes to trade, we put a market access on the table. Our U.S. friends don't have an ability to do so. And what I find in terms of countries in the region, when they want to engage with us on free trade, they really welcome the fact that we're putting market access on the table. That's a helpful differentiator for us. Another one that I find differentiates us from allies and for our partners in the region is that we have a real underlying commitment to the Sustainable Development Goals 2030. So in a world that is focused on security and so on, the fact that we come with a real intent both domestically and internationally to contribute to SDGs 2030 is a positive engagement as well. We really believe in inclusive growth. And we know that a successful and a sustainable economy means that all parts of society needs to benefit from economic growth. We have developed, I think, a bit of a global track record on that domestically, and we'd like to engage with those countries who believe in that to incorporate that as well in their country in terms of inclusive growth and governance. But it's not going to be applied across on a consistent. It'll be based on those that will resonate on each of those differentiated features that I talked about. And then, of course, the last most obvious is, we are the fourth, fifth largest fossil fuels producer in the world, but also a commitment to embrace a climate change policy that is perhaps more aggressive than those in a similar benchmark. There is a climate change action plan frameworks that perhaps we can help others as they go through their challenging domestic networks as well. So I think there is an international toolkit that Canada can bring to bear that is also, in addition to what certain countries are looking for on the hard security side, cybersecurity, trying to help mitigate disinformation, helping on mitigating threats, counterterrorism, and so on, in terms of what I would call the traditional, but also the non-traditional as well as those differentiators going forward. And the needs of South Asia versus the needs of Southeast Asia will have to be calibrated accordingly.
So, Paul, I know that you need to get back to the Indo-Pacific strategy, skunk works to the coalface to carry on the work that you've been doing, and you've been very generous with your time. I'll just make one observation for my part, that I have a personal observation that I've made in another forum, which is about Canada and strategy, whether we're talking foreign policy or grand strategies generally, that my own observation is that Canada, compared with many other countries, Canada doesn't really do strategy very much or very well. And my personal theory is that the causes of this are similar to the reasons why the Toronto Maple Leafs are incapable of winning championships in a really statistically improbable fashion in a league where they are either the most valuable or second most valuable franchise with the most resources. And I say this as a Torontonian. It pains me to say it, and the reason is they don't need to win championships. They've had it's the most valuable team in the league without really having to win. And I think that has been, Australians talk about being the lucky country. I think we have been in that situation. We have not been compelled to make strategy the way for some countries, like Israel, this is an existential issue. You really have to have strategies. The US, you have choices, resources to deploy all around the world. You have to have a strategy, and so on and so forth. And in Canada, we've been able to muddle through without doing it. And having dabbled a bit in this foreign policy strategy game myself in my career, I also know that it's painful to do. And like any kind of organisms, we're averse to doing things that are painful, and we seek the quiet life. And I introduce all of this just to make the point that it is painful. It's a hard thing to do. I think if Canadian governments were in the habit of issuing white papers on a regular basis on various things, all of this would not be quite so difficult, because we would get used to having more conversations and more policy dialogue instead of rolling it up into a giant snowball to be released once every decade and a half. But that's where we are. It's difficult work, and I have to say it's generally historically been thankless work. And I just want to take this opportunity to thank you and your colleagues for working on this. It shouldn't be thankless work, and we're grateful for the work that you do, and we're really grateful to you for coming and sharing your thoughts with us today, and we wish you all the best. Thank you very much.